My name is Rachel Ibarra. I'm 32 and I'm a veterinary technician at a busy animal hospital in Denver, Colorado, which means I understand better than most people exactly how thoroughly a veterinary office documents every single visit, treatment, and payment associated with the patient's file. Told by my own aunt, in front of my entire extended family at a memorial gathering for my mother, that I'd essentially abandoned our family dog after mom passed away. I stood in my aunt's living room 3 months ago, holding a cup of coffee I'd stopped drinking, and listened to her tell a version of events that the veterinary clinic's own records would directly contradict within the week. Rachel just dropped Biscuit off with our aunt and never looked back. My own Aunt Carmen had said to my cousins, gesturing toward where the elderly dog was curled up on a dog bed near the fireplace. She couldn't even be bothered to check in on him. If you're watching this, comment where you're from and what time it is right now for you, and hit subscribe, because you need to see how this played out. This one runs long, so stay with me. Let me take you back to where this actually started. At my mother, Elena Ibarra, adopted Biscuit, a golden retriever mix, as an 8-week-old puppy in the same year she finalized her divorce from my father, a coincidence she used to joke about often, telling anyone who'd listen that he was the one relationship that particular year that actually worked out the way it was supposed to. She'd found him at a municipal shelter in Aurora, Colorado, a scrawny, anxious puppy who'd been surrendered along with 2 litter mates by a family who could no longer afford to keep any of them, and something about his particular combination of nervousness and stubborn friendliness, she always said, made the decision for her before she'd even fully finished filling out the adoption paperwork. Biscuit became, over the following 14 years, something considerably more central to my mother's daily life than most people's relationships with their pets tend to be. He slept in her bed every single night of his life until circumstances eventually changed that arrangement, rode in the passenger seat of her car for errands the way a person might rather than a dog, and developed, over the years, an almost eerie attunement to her moods and routines that longtime friends and neighbors commented on regularly. When my mother worked from home during the later years of her career as a freelance bookkeeper, Biscuit positioned himself, without fail, directly beneath her desk, a warm, constant presence she often described as the only coworker who's never once complained about my music choices. I grew up alongside Biscuit myself, though I moved out of my mother's house at 18 for college and afterward built my own independent life in an apartment that, like most rental buildings in my price range in Denver, didn't allow dogs, meaning my relationship with Biscuit through my 20s consisted mostly of visits to my mother's house rather than any direct daily caretaking responsibility. I loved him genuinely, in the way you love a family member's pet who's been present for your entire adult life, but I want to be honest that my relationship with him, before my mother's death, was considerably more peripheral than what came afterward. My mother's illness came on with alarming speed. She was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer just under 5 months before she passed, a diagnosis that arrived with a prognosis grim enough that our family spent those final months less in a mode of fighting the illness and more in a mode of trying to ensure her remaining time was as comfortable and meaningful as possible. Biscuit, by then 11 years old himself, stayed close to her bedside throughout her decline in a way that one of the hospice nurses, near the very end, described to me as the most devoted patient companion I've encountered in 15 years of this work, an observation that has stayed with me since, both as a source of comfort and as a genuinely painful image I still think about often, of a dog refusing to leave a dying woman's side because some part of him understood, in whatever way dogs understand these things, that something significant was happening. My mother passed away 8 months before the events at the center of this story, and the weeks immediately following her death were, predictably, some of the most disorienting and overwhelming of my entire life. I was, practically speaking, the primary person handling the logistics of her passing, the funeral arrangements, the considerable estate paperwork that comes with even a modest estate, the physical closure of her apartment, the coordination with her employer regarding final matters, the endless phone calls to various institutions that needed to be formally notified of her death. In the middle of all of this, Biscuit, now 14 years old and already showing the physical toll of age even before the additional stress of losing his primary person, needed somewhere stable to stay. My own apartment building's no pets policy made taking him and myself impossible without an extended, uncertain process of either breaking my lease or finding alternative housing, neither of which felt remotely manageable given everything else I was simultaneously handling in those first devastating weeks. My Aunt Carmen, my mother's older sister by 4 years, offered to take Biscuit in temporarily, an offer I accepted with genuine gratitude, since Carmen lived in a house with a yard and had, historically, been fond of Biscuit during family gatherings over the years. I want to emphasize that I never resented this arrangement or felt Carmen was somehow overstepping by taking on his daily care. Quite the opposite. I was relieved to have somewhere stable and loving for him to land during a period when I genuinely wasn't in any position, emotionally or logistically, to manage full-time care of an elderly, grieving dog on top of everything else. My mother's death had suddenly made my responsibility. What I did take on myself quietly, without turning it into any kind of formal family discussion or announcement, was full responsibility for Biscuit's veterinary care going forward, a decision that emerged naturally out of my professional background as a veterinary technician, rather than any explicit negotiation with Carmen about dividing his caretaking responsibilities. Carmen would handle his daily needs, feeding, walks, general companionship, the accommodations an aging dog with increasing mobility issues requires day to day. I would handle everything medical, an arrangement that made practical sense given my professional knowledge, but which I'd eventually realize created exactly the kind of divided, partially invisible responsibility structure that led to the confrontation the story centers on. Over the following 8 months, I scheduled and personally handled every single veterinary need Biscuit had, a responsibility that turned out to be considerably more involved than either Carmen or I had probably anticipated at the outset, given his age and the accumulating health issues that tend to surface in dogs entering their mid-teens. The first significant appointment came about 6 weeks after my mother's passing, a comprehensive senior wellness exam I scheduled proactively. Given my professional awareness that grief and disruption in a dog's routine can sometimes mask or exacerbate underlying health issues that might otherwise go unnoticed, that exam revealed significant dental disease, for teeth requiring extraction, a discovery that meant scheduling a full dental procedure under anesthesia, a genuinely nerve-wracking prospect for a 14-year-old dog, given the real elevated risks anesthesia carries for older animals with potentially compromised organ function. I remember that specific day with unusual clarity. I drove Biscuit to my own clinic, where I could ensure he received the most careful, attentive treatment from colleagues I trusted completely, having worked alongside them for years myself. I dropped him off early that morning and then, rather than returning to my own apartment or attempting to work, found myself sitting in my car in the clinic's parking lot for the entire 3-hour duration of the procedure, unable to focus on anything else, checking my phone every few minutes for any update despite knowing, professionally, that no update was likely to come until the procedure was fully complete. When one of my colleagues finally called to let me know Biscuit had come through the procedure well and was recovering normally in the clinic's post-anesthesia recovery area, I sat in that parking lot and cried harder than I had during several distinct moments of my own mother's actual funeral just weeks earlier, an emotional displacement I've thought about often in the months since. There's something about a smaller, more contained crisis, a dog's dental surgery, successfully completed, that sometimes becomes the specific place where larger, harder to access grief finally finds a pathway to the surface, a phenomenon I understand intellectually from my professional exposure to grieving pet owners, but which felt entirely different and considerably more disorienting to experience myself. The following months brought additional appointments in a steady, if not overwhelming, rhythm. A follow-up regarding the arthritis he'd been managing for the past several years, requiring a medication adjustment given his advancing age and some new stiffness Carmen had mentioned noticing in his hind legs. A concerning lump discovered during a routine checkup, located along his ribcage, that necessitated a decision about whether to simply monitor it or pursue more definitive testing. I want to be honest about how I handled that particular decision, because I think it reveals something important about how my professional background shaped my approach to his care in ways that occasionally created friction, however unintentional, with Carmen's more instinctively cautious approach. My veterinarian, entirely reasonably from a general medical standpoint, suggested we could simply monitor the lump for a few months, given that the vast majority of such growths in dogs of Biscuit's breed and age turn out to be benign lipomas requiring no intervention. I understood this statistical reality clearly from my own professional training. But I also understood that statistically unlikely to be serious isn't the same reassurance as definitely fine. And I found myself unwilling, in a way I couldn't have fully articulated to Carmen in the moment, to simply wait and monitor something when a same-week biopsy was a realistic, available option. I made that call, insisting on the immediate biopsy rather than the more conservative monitoring approach, within roughly an hour of the initial exam, before I'd even fully processed my own anxiety about the situation, because the clinical procedural part of my professional training kicked in noticeably faster than the emotional processing did. A sequence I've since recognized as fairly typical for me across a number of high-stress situations in my life, generally, not just this specific one, involving Biscuit. The biopsy results came back benign, as statistically expected, but I don't regret insisting on the more immediate, definitive answer rather than living with several months of uncertainty. Given everything else I was simultaneously processing that year, that I want to describe why I never turned any of this into an ongoing topic of family conversation. Because I think understanding my own reasoning helps explain how the eventual confrontation was able to develop the way it did. Part of my silence about these appointments was simply personality. I've never been especially inclined to narrate my own efforts publicly, a trait that predates any of this and extends across most areas of my life, not specifically related to Biscuit's care. But a larger part of it, honestly, was that I was processing my own grief over my mother's death in a way that made me generally quieter across nearly all family communication during those 8 months, not specifically regarding Biscuit. I stopped participating as actively in the extended family group chat generally. I declined several social invitations I would ordinarily have accepted. My silence about Biscuit's veterinary appointments wasn't a deliberate strategy of quiet documentation. It was simply one small piece of a broader pattern of withdrawal that characterized how I moved through that entire period of loss. I also paid for every single veterinary visit entirely out of my own account, a decision I made deliberately and have never regretted, because I felt strongly that Biscuit's ongoing medical needs shouldn't become an additional financial burden on Carmen, given everything else she was already generously providing in terms of his daily care and housing. This meant that from a purely financial record standpoint, my name and payment method appeared consistently on every single visit's billing record, a detail that would eventually become significant in ways I couldn't have anticipated at the time. Carmen, throughout these 8 months, settled into her own consistent rhythm of daily care for Biscuit, adjusting her morning schedule to accommodate his slower, more careful walks given his arthritis, rearranging some furniture in her home to make navigation easier for a dog whose mobility was clearly declining, generally providing exactly the kind of stable, loving daily presence I'd hoped for when we first arranged for him to stay with her. I never disputed or resented this role. And I want to be clear that Carmen's contribution to Biscuit's well-being during this period was genuinely significant and shouldn't be diminished simply because this story ultimately centers on correcting her account of the medical side of his care, specifically. The situation resolved itself further the following week, in a way I genuinely hadn't anticipated when I first scheduled what was simply a routine follow-up appointment regarding Biscuit's arthritis medication. I invited Carmen to come along this time, partly wanting to include her more directly in his ongoing medical care going forward, and partly, if I'm honest, because some part of me wanted her to see firsthand exactly what these appointments actually involved, beyond the abstract idea of vet visits she'd apparently been picturing. We arrived at the clinic together, and the receptionist checking us in, a woman I knew well from my own years working in a similar role elsewhere in the city, pulled up Biscuit's file with the easy familiarity of routine administrative work. "Looks like you're due for his 6th visit this year," she mentioned casually, glancing at her screen. "Let me just confirm the payment method on file is still the same card ending in the digits we have." She then, entirely unprompted and simply following her own standard check-in procedure rather than any awareness of the tension underlying this particular visit, read off the visit history directly from his file for confirmation purposes. March, dental cleaning. April, follow-up on the extraction sites. June, the lump biopsy. July, medication adjustment for the arthritis. And today makes visit 6, all under Rachel Ibarra's account. Carmen, sitting beside me in the waiting room, went quiet, visibly processing this specific, dated, itemized list she just heard read aloud with no dramatic intention whatsoever behind it. It was, from the receptionist's perspective, nothing more than a routine confirmation of billing details. From Carmen's perspective, sitting there absorbing it, it was apparently something considerably more significant. I didn't realize it had been that many visits, she said quietly, once we were seated alone together in the exam room, waiting for the veterinarian to come in for Biscuit's actual appointment. It's been a lot, I said, not unkindly, genuinely wanting this conversation to land as clarifying rather than accusatory. He's old, and there have been a few real health scares along the way. Mom would have wanted him taken care of properly, and taking care of that side of things has honestly meant a lot to me, in ways I don't think I've fully explained to you before now. I never meant to make you feel like your role in his daily life didn't matter, Carmen. I just also didn't want my own part in his care to keep getting erased, simply because I wasn't loud about it. Carmen's eyes filled with tears then, unexpected and clearly genuine rather than performed. I think I've been so focused on how much I'm doing for him day to day, she admitted, that I somehow convinced myself I was doing literally everything for him. I didn't think about how much the medical care actually costs, or how much coordinating all of it takes, because I simply wasn't the one doing that particular part, and it stayed invisible to me in a way I don't think I fully appreciated until just now, hearing it all listed out like that. I want to return, briefly, to why Biscuit's medical care mattered so intensely to me during this period, beyond simply my professional comfort with veterinary matters, because I think understanding that emotional dimension explains something important about the whole situation that a purely logistical account might miss. Given how completely inseparable Biscuit had been from my mother's daily life for 14 years, I think part of why I took his medical care so seriously wasn't purely professional habit, though that certainly shaped my comfort level with the various decisions involved. It was also, honestly, a way of continuing to actively care for my mother in the only remaining way still available to me after her death. Scheduling his dental cleaning felt, in some strange but genuine emotional sense, like an extension of the caretaking I'd been doing for her directly during her own illness in those final months. Insisting on the immediate biopsy rather than a wait and monitor approach felt, at the time, entirely non-negotiable to me in a way I couldn't have fully explained to Carmen in that moment, because some part of me simply couldn't tolerate the prospect of losing anything else connected to my mother without first having done absolutely everything medically possible to prevent it. He still smelled faintly like my mother's apartment for the first few months after she passed, a specific combination of her particular perfume, and the wood floor cleaner she'd always used, and sitting with him in various waiting rooms throughout those 8 months, running my hands through his graying fur while we waited to be called back for whatever appointment brought us there that day, felt like one of the few remaining physical connections I still had access to regarding her actual daily life, rather than simply the abstract fact of her absence. I also want to be genuinely fair to Carmen in recounting all of this, because I don't believe, even now, that she intended to erase my contribution out of any real malice. I think she was simply, understandably, absorbed in her own daily caretaking role. The walks, the feeding schedule, the constant, quiet companionship of having Biscuit present in her house every single day, and that daily, highly visible presence made it genuinely easy for her to lose sight of the less visible medical coordination happening around and alongside her own contribution. Grief affects people's perspective in strange, sometimes disorienting ways, and I think Carmen, simultaneously mourning her own younger sister while also taking on unexpected, significant responsibility for that sister's aging dog, wasn't fully tracking with any real precision who was actually doing what beyond her own immediate daily experience of the situation. That's a genuinely human failing rather than a deliberate campaign to erase my involvement, even though the effect, when she voiced it publicly at that memorial gathering, landed considerably harder on me than I think she anticipated or intended. The conversation we had in that exam room, once she'd absorbed the full scope of his documented medical care, ended up becoming one of the more honest conversations Carmen and I have had since my mother's funeral, extending well beyond just the specifics of Biscuit's veterinary bills into a broader conversation about grief itself. We talked for what I believe was actually the first time since the funeral about how differently we'd each processed losing my mother. Carmen through the daily, physical presence of caring for something she genuinely loved, a living connection to her sister she could tend to directly every day, and me through a more clinical, task-oriented management of practical matters that I think let me avoid sitting with the rawer parts of my grief too, directly for too long at any given stretch. Biscuit is doing reasonably well for his age these days, his arthritis reasonably well managed through the medication adjustments, his overall dental health considerably improved since the extraction procedure, and Carmen and I have settled into a genuinely more collaborative rhythm regarding his ongoing care since that conversation in the exam room. She handles his daily life, as she always has, and I continue managing the medical side of things, but now with her fuller understanding and, I think, genuine appreciation of what that particular responsibility actually involves, both practically and emotionally. She started coming to more of his appointments herself since that day, genuinely curious now about the specifics rather than simply assuming they happen on their own without any real effort or coordination behind them. It's a small shift, but a meaningful one, and I think it reflects something larger about how the correction that happened in that exam room ultimately strengthened rather than damaged our relationship once the initial discomfort of the correction itself had passed. Carmen and I don't discuss my mother directly all that often. Even now, 8 months on from her death, and several months past the memorial gathering where this particular misunderstanding first surfaced publicly. But Biscuit has become, in an entirely unplanned way, one of the more reliable bridges between us for that larger, harder conversation about grief, a living, aging reminder of her that neither of us has to work particularly hard to bring up naturally in conversation, since his continued presence in both our lives does that emotional work for us, almost automatically, every time either of us mentions how he's doing. Here's what I actually learned, standing in my aunt's living room that afternoon, and later sitting in that exam room listening to a veterinary receptionist's entirely routine check-in procedure do more to correct the record than my own words had managed to accomplish in the moment itself. Quiet care doesn't always register as genuine care if someone else's daily visibility happens to overshadow it in the family's collective understanding of a situation. People can tell a story about your absence as confidently and as repeatedly as they like. They can't argue with 6 documented, itemized veterinary visits, each one dated and listed under your own name and payment method, for an aging dog who still, in his own quiet way, connects both of you back to the specific woman you're each still, in your own different fashion, learning how to grieve. If this hit close to home, tell me in the comments about a time your own quiet contribution got overshadowed by someone else's more visible, daily presence in a shared situation. Subscribe if you want to see how these stories keep unfolding. Share this with someone in your life who's ever cared for something or someone quietly, without ever needing anyone else to notice or acknowledge it, and I'll see you in the next one.